Hello dear viewers, and welcome to the channel. Today we will travel to ancient Rome, a world where slaves were an unnoticed but integral part of everyday existence. We will talk about what it meant to be a slave in this ancient society, what their day was like, the challenges they faced, the responsibilities they had, and the realities of their lives. But don't worry, our story will be slow, calm, and quiet, so you can relax and drift off to sleep as our story takes you back in time. We won't rush it. Before we begin, please don't forget to like this video if you like it, and comment where you're watching from and what time it is. This way, we'll be interested to know who's with us at this moment, and when exactly you decided to dive into history. So, let's begin our journey through the history of slavery in ancient Rome. Imagine a world where the splendor and power of ancient Rome hides many unnoticed but vital stories. In this world of wrath and glory, wealth and luxury, among majestic temples, bustling markets, and flamboyant gladiatorial battles, there is another reality: the lives of slaves. Their presence is invisible to most, but without their labor and sacrifice, Rome would not have become as great as we know it today. Slavery was an integral part of Roman society. About 1/3 of Rome's population was, at one point in time, slaves. This figure is astonishing because we tend to think of ancient Rome as a civilization full of grandeur and power. However, behind all this grandeur was the hard work that slaves did. But who were they? How did they end up in slavery, and what did their lives look like? First, it's worth understanding how slaves came to Rome. One of the most common ways was through captivity. Ancient Rome waged endless wars, conquering more and more lands. Prisoners who fell into Roman hands were often taken to the capital or to other parts of the empire. They became slaves, deprived of rights and freedom. They often came to Rome as prisoners who were simply sold in the markets as goods. But what happened to those people who became slaves as a result of this cruel system? During the war, the Romans captured not only soldiers, but also civilians, women, and children. Sometimes entire cities fell under the control of Rome, and every inhabitant became a slave. Imagine what it was like to be part of a prosperous civilization, but in an instant lose everything: freedom, home, relatives. For those who survived captivity, the beginning of a slave life was especially difficult, because in addition to physical labor, they also had to get used to completely new living conditions. The second path to slavery was more dramatic and almost tragic: debt slavery. Ancient Rome had a strict financial system, and sometimes people could not pay off their debts. In these cases, they sold themselves into slavery for a certain period of time to pay off their debts. But, as a rule, debt slavery was long and hard, and as a result, such slavery often became eternal. Imagine that you lost your freedom because you could not pay for bread, for the necessary things. You became a slave, and your children born into this slavery would also become slaves. This is not just a loss of personal freedom, but also of your entire future. Another way, which was less common but still happened, was being born into slavery. If one of the parents was a slave, then the child born to that person would also become a slave. This was done to ensure the continuity of the slave system. A person born a slave had no opportunity to become a free citizen. His life was predetermined from the beginning, and his choices were limited. Now, let's try to understand a little about the role of slaves in the Roman economy. In Roman society, slavery was not just a phenomenon, it was the most important element on which the entire economy was based. Slaves performed various tasks. They worked in the fields, served in the houses of aristocrats, built roads, maintained temples. Slaves were an integral part of Roman life, and at the same time, they remained completely deprived of rights. In order to understand the scale of their work, imagine what a city looks like. Streets decorated with majestic buildings, theaters, markets, where life is in full swing, but someone had to build, maintain, clean all this. These were the slaves, those who ensured the existence of the city, but their work remained invisible. This was the cruel reality. The more slaves there were, the more prosperous Rome became, but no one paid attention to them. So, what was life like for slaves in Rome, beyond the hard physical labor? First of all, it should be noted that slaves were largely deprived of personal rights. They could not own property, marry, or be protected by law. Even if slaves had great mental or physical abilities, they were still in the hands of their masters. And yet, in Rome, there were slave owners who had some power. And this created a unique and complex relationship between slaves and their masters. Slaves who were kept in wealthy households, for example as personal assistants or child caretakers, were sometimes luckier than those who worked in mines or galleys. However, their situation remained difficult and unstable. A slave was essentially the property of his masters, and his life depended on their will. Sometimes, if a slave was clever or useful enough, he could earn the trust of his masters and even gain some position in the household. However, even in these cases, slaves could never be sure of their future. They had no property of their own, could not move freely, and could be sold like any other commodity if necessary. So, what was left for slaves in ancient Rome? The answer is simple: only humility and continuous work. The lives of most slaves were devoid of joy, because every day was the same as the previous one. However, among all these difficulties, there was one important thing: hope. Sometimes slaves dreamed of freedom. They dreamed that they could buy themselves, that they could one day feel what it was like to be a free person. Slavery in Rome remained a grim reality, but it also served as an important link in the chain that ensured the development of the empire. We may not always notice its influence, but it was always there, like a shadow that followed this great but cruel society. Now that we understand how slavery became an integral part of ancient Rome, let's focus on what slaves were like in this society. There were several categories of slaves in Rome, each with their own unique living and working conditions. Although they were all deprived of their freedom, their fates and duties often varied greatly. Some worked in the luxurious homes of patricians. Others toiled on dirty and dangerous galleys. Others worked the land as agricultural slaves. And still others could be skilled craftsmen performing complex artisanal tasks. Let's take a closer look at these different types of slaves, their lives, their duties, and the role they played in Roman society. House slaves probably had the least physical work, but their lives were far from luxurious. A slave serving in the wealthy household of a Roman patrician was often required to take care of the household, manage the property, serve the family, and perform a variety of other domestic duties. Such slaves worked in the master's rooms, kitchens, and gardens, sometimes becoming trusted assistants who supervised affairs and coordinated other work. For them, the day began early. First, preparation for the morning routine, cleaning, serving breakfast, cooking for family members, helping with clothing. Slaves in charge of children sometimes raised the children of wealthy Romans, taught them literacy and music. This was no easy task because a child was the future of the family, and the educator had a whole life in his hands, and therefore a whole career. However, despite these important duties, domestic slaves remained completely under the control of their owners, and their work was not paid for, as in the modern sense. And even if slaves were in the role of assistants or educators, their existence was still difficult and dependent on the mood of their owners. Many domestic slaves in Rome became such important figures in the household that at some point they could even be given a certain amount of power. For example, house managers or even house secretaries who held the keys to all the rooms and could manage the property of the owners. However, this power was fragile. At any moment, a slave could be punished for the slightest mistake or simply sold. For these slaves, life could often feel like a trap. They lived in luxury that was not for them. The building they worked in was foreign to them. It brought them no joy. Their work was invisible, despite its importance. The slaves who worked on agricultural lands lived and worked in a completely different world. They were not surrounded by luxury and did not see the prosperity that their colleagues in rich houses enjoyed. Unlike domestic slavery, the life of an agricultural slave was connected with daily work in the fields, with growing crops, caring for animals, and harvesting crops. Field work in ancient Rome was hard and grueling. Slaves were used for all types of work, from sowing to harvesting, plowing, weeding, making hay. All these jobs required hard physical effort, often in hot climates. Slaves had to work from dawn to dusk, and during these hours they could not afford to rest. But life in the fields was not all. Many of these slaves lived in terrible conditions. They often slept in primitive huts, under the sky, surrounded by nature, but far from human warmth. Yes, the air was fresh and the stars were beautiful, but for a slave these beauties could not console from the burden of daily life. Slaves in workshops also faced physical labor. Roman craftsmen, from blacksmiths to weavers, worked in workshops where their work was no less difficult. They produced all sorts of products, from weapons to utensils. Slaves working in such workshops were required to monitor the quality of the products, often processing materials that required precision and patience. These craftsmen often lived and worked in cramped conditions, in rooms filled with fire, noise, and odors. Like agricultural slaves, foremen and factory workers had long and grueling hours of work. However, despite the hardships of their work, their lives were not entirely devoid of dignity. Unlike galley slaves or miners, they sometimes received small privileges and could become renowned masters of their craft. However, slaves remained dependent on their masters, and their fate was in the hands of those who managed their labor. Now, imagine the life of a slave who works not in a workshop or a field, but in the mines or on galleys. This is one of the most brutal forms of slavery in ancient Rome, and work in these conditions was terrible, full of danger and fear. Galley slaves were not only forced to work hard, they were also exposed to constant danger. Working in dark, damp, and stuffy galleys, they rode all day long, often without the opportunity to rest. Not only that, they were vulnerable to severe punishments if they did not row fast enough. Fatal diseases, physical fatigue, thirst, and hunger were all part of their daily lives. Sometimes these slaves lived so long that they became part of the crew and were unable to leave the ship. A galley slave was condemned to serve for the rest of his life. He did not know what freedom was, and his work was his only reality. Slaves who worked on galleys were often used as labor, and in case of accidents or illnesses, they were simply replaced by new ones. The slaves in the mines had an equally hard life. Life in the mines of Rome was dangerous, full of hardship and fear. Unsettled ground, collapsing walls, fear for life. All this was part of their terrible work. These slaves did not see the sun for days and weeks. Their work was associated with high risks. But, as with the galleys, they had no choice but to continue to work. However, there were slaves who achieved mastery in their craft. Slave artisans and artists were used to create art objects that decorated the homes of wealthy Romans. These slaves often became talented sculptors, painters, or architects. Their work was appreciated, but they remained slaves, deprived of the right to dispose of their creations. Slaves who had achieved a high level of skill could even be entrusted with important government orders. For example, they were often commissioned to build bridges, temples, and statues. Despite such achievements, they could not escape slavery, and although their name might be known among the upper classes, their status remained the same. They were property. So, in ancient Rome, there were several types of slaves, each with unique challenges and responsibilities. Despite the different types of work and living conditions, all slaves were deprived of the most important thing: freedom. Every day their lives became more difficult, but despite this, they continued to live, work, and fight for their existence, every minute, day after day. Imagine Rome, majestic and luxurious, with its ancient temples, wide streets, beautiful villas, and loud markets. This is a city where the world of wealth and power intertwines with the world of hard work and deprivation. If you decide to walk along its streets, you will definitely notice that, in the shadow of these majestic structures, among the luxurious buildings and marble palaces, there are completely different, less visible, but no less important spaces: the housing of slaves. These spaces, unfortunately, were far from what we are used to considering comfort. However, their role in the life of ancient Rome was invaluable, because slaves were the ones who ensured the functioning of this magnificent city and its entire empire. Now, let's take a closer look at what slaves' homes looked like in ancient Rome. This is not just a description of the places where they lived. It is an attempt to understand how these simple and humble dwellings reflected the essence of slave life, a life filled with work, deprivation, and, despite this, retaining some human value. First, let's look at the slaves who lived in wealthy Roman homes. The jobs these slaves performed varied, from childcare to managing the household and serving their masters. But no matter how high they stood in the slave hierarchy, their living quarters were modest and often cramped. A wealthy Roman's home, or villa, was often multi-roomed and luxurious, with magnificent decorations and huge courtyards. Both the slave owners and their families lived in these villas. However, slaves, even if they played an important role in the house, still occupied their own modest corners. At best, these were small rooms in the basement or attic, or even in separate buildings in the courtyard. These spaces were often windowless and poorly lit. They were often damp and cold, especially in winter. But in some cases, if the slave was especially important to the owners, for example, a house manager or personal tutor, his dwelling might be a little more comfortable. However, even in this case, the rooms remained reserved, dark, and not very spacious. The comfort situation was similar in wealthy Roman homes and elsewhere. Sometimes slaves lived on the second or third floors of buildings, or in special areas designated only for their residence. The furniture was modest, simple wooden beds, tables, and chairs, sometimes some items for personal hygiene and cleaning. But an important element of such dwellings was that they were often located in close proximity to the living spaces of the owners. Slaves were always nearby, ready for any request of the owners. On the one hand, this allowed them to be part of the family's overall life, but on the other, it cut them off from the world. They had no private space, no personal corners where they could be alone. Their lives were public, open to control and surveillance, and this fact was not only physically, but also psychologically exhausting. An important part of their lives was constant control, sometimes harsh, but often simply demanding attention and compliance at all levels. Now, let's move to the countryside, to Roman farms, where slave labor was no less intense, and their living conditions were not just modest, but extremely difficult. Slave owners on farms might have much simpler homes, often surrounded by large agricultural fields where slaves worked the fields. These areas required daily labor, sowing, tending to the crops, picking fruits and vegetables, and tending to animals. And while these farmers did not always have luxurious homes, the slaves on these fields endured far more hardship. On such farms, slaves often lived in terrible conditions. Their housing was simple and completely unsuitable for comfortable living. These were small wooden houses or even tents, without any insulation from the weather. Cold in winter, hot in summer. Slaves were exposed to harsh conditions from both nature and their owners. In these conditions, most slaves spent all their time maintaining the farm, caring for animals, and working in the fields. Sometimes there were no beds in such houses. Slaves slept on straw or simple wooden platforms. It is important to remember that for slaves there was no difference between day and night. Their life was subject to the rhythm of work. When the day ended and it got dark, they still continued to work, sometimes until the morning. There was no time for rest, and for most slaves on the farms there was no personal life. Their life was connected with constant physical labor and submission to the masters. These living conditions can be compared to those of animals, although sometimes it was easier for animals. At least they were not obliged to serve a person every minute, who expected their complete devotion and continuous work. Slaves working in workshops or on construction sites often lived in even more unfavorable conditions. They worked from dawn to dusk, helping to create the objects that would become part of the Roman Empire. These were large and complex structures: roads, aqueducts, bridges, statues, and temples. These works required not only great labor, but also skill, which meant that slaves working in such workshops sometimes became specialists in their field. But despite this, their housing was still extremely poor. Slaves in workshops or construction camps often lived in cramped barracks or outside, in conditions where they had no shelter from the rain or cold. Work in such places began early and ended late, often at night, in order to complete the project on time. In such conditions, they had no basic amenities. Housing was often little more than a filthy room where several slaves slept on wooden platforms that did not protect them from the cold or disease. The food for these slaves was modest, often consisting of bread, water, and a few vegetables, if conditions allowed. The work on the construction sites was physically demanding, adding stress and strain to their lives. What do all these slave dwellings have in common, whether in a rich house, on a farm, or in a workshop? It is the complete absence of personal space. The slave had no corner where he could go to feel like an individual for a moment. His entire life was public. All his actions were controlled. Even the most important moments, rest, time for sleep, became part of his constant work. Slaves were not allowed to create their own lives. Even in those rare cases where a slave could enjoy some privileges or peace, their lives were still directed solely at fulfilling the wishes and orders of others. They could not start a family, could not create their own home, and often lived alone. Their homes were empty not only physically, but also emotionally. Now that we understand how difficult it was for slaves to live in these conditions, let's smoothly move on to the next part, where we will analyze in detail how a slave's day began, what their duties were, what they had to do every morning, what difficulties their daily life began with. This will help us understand what their daily routine looked like and how they faced this difficult reality. Imagine an early morning in ancient Rome. The city is just beginning to wake up. The first rays of the sun barely touching the roofs of the majestic buildings, wrapping them in a soft light. The streets are still silent, only sounds coming from afar, the distant footsteps of people starting their day, and the rustling of the wind. But at this moment in life, millions of slaves are already awake, ready for their inevitable labor. Their morning begins much earlier than that of those who enjoy wealth and peace, for a slave's day begins with the first signs of dawn, and he has no right to rest until nightfall. When a slave wakes up, he has no opportunity to just lie in bed for a few more minutes, not to think about the day ahead, or to give himself time to think. His day begins with duties. It is a morning full of duties, duties that often give him absolutely no chance to relax. But it is through these morning hours that one can better understand what life was like for slaves in ancient Rome, not only in terms of work, but also in terms of how they experienced their daily lives in this cruel system. The slave wakes up almost at the first light of dawn, around 5 or 6 in the morning. This is the time when it is still dark and the first signs of life are just beginning to appear on the streets. In these morning hours, when many Romans are still asleep, the slaves are already beginning their work. Imagine the sounds of awakening when they open their eyes and realize that they cannot afford to stay in bed. In the house where they serve, if it is a rich villa, there is already noise. Perhaps the footsteps of the masters, the cries of children, sounds coming from the kitchen. Life was never easy for slaves, and these morning hours are the moment when their service begins again. Light, golden rays flood their space, but there is no time to enjoy it. Even if a slave working in a patrician's house is in a relatively good position, his morning time is already several minutes of tension as he must quickly get up, line up in order, and begin his duties. Time is relentless, and slaves must be ready to be efficient from the very morning. In their world, morning is the moment of preparation for a long working day. If you imagine these morning hours through the prism of sensory impressions, you can feel the coolness of the morning air, the instability of the light, when shadows and light intertwine on the walls, as if the walls themselves have not yet awakened. But for slaves, morning is a moment when every sound, every movement matters. In their lives, every morning is a chance to prove their usefulness again. Once a slave wakes up, he does not have to waste time choosing clothes or resting. His day begins with a direct duty. If he works in the house of a rich Roman, the first thing he has to do is clean. This task seems simple, but it begins even before the masters wake up. He cleans the chambers, the courtyards, the stairs, and all the corners that the eyes of the masters will see. Every detail is important. Nothing must be forgotten or overlooked, otherwise he will be punished. But cleaning is just the beginning. Slaves often perform other duties as well, such as cooking for the master's family. Each morning requires precision and discipline to ensure that all the necessary ingredients are provided for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. In some households with many slaves, one slave may be responsible for the entire cooking process, including chopping, boiling, casseroling, and serving the food to the masters. This requires not only physical effort, but mental control as well. Imagine slaves standing by huge ovens, carefully cutting bread, boiling vegetables, preparing meat. In the kitchen, which smells of fresh products, everyone must work in sync. The rhythm of slave life is a smooth, continuous process in which there is no room for error. If the owner demands more food, or there are unexpected guests, the slave must quickly respond and complete the task without any questions. Morning for slaves is the time when they need to work in a coordinated manner so as not to irritate their masters. It is these hours, filled with worries and work, that have become an important part of their existence. For the masters, this is the time to rest, to prepare themselves for days filled with personal affairs and meetings. But for slaves, this is the hour when their strength begins to deplete, and their obligations to their masters grow. If a slave works on a farm, his morning begins even earlier, with the first signs of day. Slaves in agricultural labor are not allowed to rest. With the sunrise, they must be ready for hard work, step, field, or garden. No matter where the farm is located, the slave population working on it begins to work at dawn. They cultivate the land, sow, harvest, look after the animals. For them, the morning is the time when they must be ready for the load. At such moments, we can smell the earth, fresh, damp, heavy, as the first rays of the sun illuminate the fields. The earth smells of moisture, of plants, of freshness. But this smell cannot comfort those who work, who are forced to work all day on these lands to provide food for the rich Romans. The work does not end until sunset. and they cannot stop to appreciate how day follows night. As soon as they begin to work, the morning air is filled with labor, the heaviness of every movement. The slaves in the fields know that their efforts are what maintain the basic vitality of the Roman Empire. Without their labor, without their efforts, Rome would not be so prosperous. But for them, this labor is only an eternal repetition of actions from which they cannot escape. And yet, despite the difficulties, there is a moment of release. This is their hope for freedom. But this hope hides in the dark corners of their minds and does not allow them to relax. For as soon as the morning comes, so too does the day, filled with heavy duties. Morning for slaves is the time when they must be at their best. Discipline and order are not just words. They are real laws that they must follow. Their whole life, their whole day is built on pleasing their masters, completing all assignments on time. For every mistake, for every error, punishment. Often, slaves do not know what awaits them on any given day, because they cannot know in advance what their masters will demand of them. However, one thing remains constant. They are expected to perform their duties perfectly. Admit it, having no opportunity for rest or relaxation, living in constant fear of punishment and threat is hard. Slaves in Rome got used to these restrictions and at some point could not even imagine life without cruel discipline. So, for slaves in ancient Rome, the morning is not just the beginning of the day. It is the beginning of a continuous struggle for survival, the hope for a better life, and the inevitable work that ends only at night. But even then, the slave may not be able to relax because his mind is always focused on his obligations. His body is always leaving traces of work. Now that we understand how a slave's day began in ancient Rome, let's dive deeper into what their daily responsibilities entailed. A slave working in a wealthy Roman household not only had to endure the physical strain of their work, but also the psychological pressure of maintaining order and getting the job done smoothly. These tasks were the bulk of their lives and defined their place in society. While working in a household, slaves could be assigned to a variety of tasks, from childcare to housekeeping, from cooking to financial management. Let's take a closer look at the duties that slaves were assigned and how they reflected their position in Roman society. One of the most common and important duties of slaves in the homes of wealthy Romans was cleaning. A slave who worked in the home of a wealthy patrician would wake up early and start his day by thoroughly cleaning all the rooms from dirt. He didn't just sweep the floor, but tidied up every corner, including courtyards, stairs, and corridors where family members often walked. Romans took pride in the cleanliness and order in their home, so this process was an important part of life. There were several areas in the house, each of which required a special approach. For example, in the kitchen, a slave had to make sure that everything was prepared for cooking. This was not just cooking, but a real ritual. Slaves prepared many dishes, often using simple but tasty ingredients: bread, vegetables, meat, fish. But the kitchen is not only a place for cooking. Slaves had to maintain order, monitor the cleanliness of the dishes, and also keep in mind the wishes of the owners. Sometimes the work of slaves in the kitchen was very demanding. For this, they had to know how to properly prepare different dishes and satisfy the requests of the most fastidious owners. Another important duty was childcare. A slave who worked as a nanny or tutor was responsible for the upbringing and education of children. It was a job that required not only patience, but also knowledge. The slave in this case became not just a servant, but a tutor and mentor, which gave him a certain role in the house, but his position remained rigid and dependent on the will of the owners. A slave who served as a tutor often taught the children of their masters not only writing and the arts, but also the harsh realities of a world where power belonged to those who could command. The task of such slaves was to create an atmosphere of strict order around the children, teaching them the rules of behavior, and also to ensure that they did not forget their place in Roman society. In this context, the role of slaves in education became a link between parents and children, but never allowed slaves to overstep the bounds of what was permitted. Not all slaves in the house performed exclusively physical work. In the house of wealthy patricians, there were also slaves who performed more intellectual duties. One of these types of slavery was the management of the master's property. The slave who served as a manager was responsible for the order in the house and also looked after financial matters. Picture this. A manager slave would wake up in the morning, and the first thing he did was count the money, check the inventory, and assign duties to the other slaves. He was responsible for managing the food supply, the expenses, and sometimes even hiring other slaves. Manager slaves were often called strategists or economists. These slaves had some freedom within their service, and although their lives were still subject to the authority of their masters, their position was more privileged. Manager slaves were often rewarded for good work, and in some cases, they could buy their freedom. The slave in the role of manager also dealt with external partners, suppliers, artisans, craftsmen, whom the owners hired for construction and repair. He interacted with the people who carried out the work and supervised the execution of this work. It was a responsible role that required not only the ability to manage, but also the ability to find a common language with people. But even in this role, slaves had no personal freedom. They could not dispose of property, even if it was their job. A slave who worked as a manager was as much a slave as one who cleaned the floors or served food. It was all part of their duty to serve, regardless of their role in the home. In addition to their main duties, slaves were often involved in various services around the house. They accompanied their masters to various events, made sure everything was in order, helped with organizing meetings, and maintained order at a banquet or celebration. Slaves working in the hall had to make sure that everything went smoothly. This included checking that all guests were present, organizing the serving of food and drinks, and maintaining the atmosphere in the hall. A slave working under such conditions had to be impeccable in his behavior, attentive and precise. He was expected not only to do his job, but also to pay attention to detail, to help his masters when they could not. Despite the importance of this role, there were still strict boundaries. A slave could never be his master's friend or equal. He was there to serve, to follow orders, and his actions were strictly controlled. Slaves at such events often had to work in the company of many guests, which added even more stress and tension. They had to be always ready, not show emotions, and strictly carry out their duties. The life of slaves in these conditions was not only physically difficult. Emotional stress and psychological pressure played a huge role in their lives. A slave could not relax at any time. He could not just be himself. His life was subject to strict discipline and continuous labor, and he himself often became part of a mechanism in which his feelings and desires did not matter. Service in the wealthy Roman households required constant attention and devotion from slaves. Every step, every action had to meet the high standards set by their masters. Even if a slave performed his work at the highest level, he still remained property and could not count on recognition or gratitude. His work was simply the norm, his role an obligatory part of the life of wealthy Romans. The emotional burden of slaves was especially great when it came to raising children. Slaves who were responsible for children often became their caregivers and mentors, and despite their subordinate position, were an integral part of the growth and development of these children. However, once the children became adults, they no longer perceived their caregivers as equals, and the latter remained in a subordinate position. Now that we have looked at the duties that slaves performed in wealthy households, let us move to a harsher reality, to the fields, workshops, and other places where slaves' work was extremely physical and often brutal. Unlike slaves working in the homes of patricians or farm managers, these slaves faced daily physical strain that became part of their daily lives. The working conditions here were far from gentle, and their work required not only high physical endurance, but also considerable fortitude in order to survive in these conditions. The slave in the fields and workshops was deprived of the luxuries that slaves in more privileged homes might have. His work involved hard physical labor that stretched out over long hours, often days. He did not know what rest in the true sense of the word was. Unlike the slaves who served the homes of Roman aristocrats, slaves who worked in workshops or on farms faced much harsher conditions, since their labor was continuous and exhausting. Imagine a field stretching to the horizon. Only a few hills and trees break the monotony of the land, covered with deep furrows from the plow. In the distance, the rustling wind can be heard, but it does not bring coolness. On the contrary, the hot air dries out the lungs. The slave working in this field stands bent over, with a heavy tool in his hands, biting into the earth with all his might to squeeze out as much as possible. This is not just work. It is a fight for life, for survival. Slaves working on agricultural lands began to work at dawn and did not stop until late in the evening. In these conditions, there was no time for rest and no room for complaint. Unlike in rich houses, where a slave could find at least a few minutes of silence, in the fields every day was like the previous one. It was work that required continuous effort, both physical and psychological. Simple tools, plows, sickles, seeders, were not only tools, but also symbols of their slavery. The slave had to use these tools to cultivate the land and provide food for all the inhabitants of the house. Every morning, he faced a task that was no different from the previous one. He again and again made furrows in the ground, sowed grain, harvested. But it was not as easy as it seemed at first glance. The earth was a cruel mistress. The slave had to not only plow the earth, but also fight the elements of nature, rain, heat, and cold. There were no easy days or easy tasks for the slaves in the fields. Even if there was a harvest, the work did not become easier. On the contrary, with each year, with each season, more effort was required to achieve the result. And what is most tragic, if the harvest was bad, the slaves could not count on forgiveness or compassion. They continued to work anyway, and often it was they who suffered the most, since the owners were always interested in making a profit. In addition to cultivating the land, slaves on farms were also often responsible for caring for animals. This required not only physical effort, but also knowledge about animals. However, knowledge about how to care for livestock was not primarily a sign of education or free choice for slaves. This knowledge served only to provide for the master's farm. Animal workers had to constantly ensure that cows, sheep, or other farm animals were fed, watered, and kept clean. From morning to evening, they were busy feeding, milking, and driving animals to pastures. But even with this routine work, the animals did not give the slave any rest or opportunity to relax. For example, in order to ensure a constant flow of milk, slaves had to milk the cows in the morning and evening. The milk had to be not only collected, but also processed if necessary. The complexity of the work was also in the fact that it continued all year round, regardless of the season or weather. In addition, working with animals did not always entail pleasant moments. Sometimes animals would get sick, and slaves had no choice but to save them, so that the owners would not suffer losses. However, slaves themselves often had no opportunity to seek medical help, since all their efforts and time were directed exclusively to fulfilling their duties. Slaves could not even be sure that they would be rewarded for their efforts. At best, they could hope for an increase in their status or freedom, but this remained only a dream. Now let's move on to the workshops where slaves worked to create art or crafts. These were places filled with the smells of wood, clay, metal, where days and nights intertwined in an endless cycle of work. Slaves working in workshops were often busy making various items, from dishes to weapons. Unlike agricultural labor, work in a workshop required not only strength, but also patience, attention, and precision. For example, in order to make quality weapons or household items, slaves had to monitor every stage of the process. Working with metal, covering wooden structures, forging, all this required not only skill, but also endurance, since working with heavy tools and materials was physically strenuous. The workshop was a world where a person could not relax, could not afford to make a mistake. Slaves who worked with metal or stone stood at hot furnaces, pulled out metal, and formed the necessary products from it. This work was often dangerous because working with fire and heavy tools, you could not only get injured, but also lose your life. Slaves in workshops were also used for more delicate work, for making jewelry, carpentry, pottery. But regardless of the type of work, the work was no less difficult. Working in the workshop was a source of constant stress and tension. Mistakes were expensive. A simple failure in the process of creating a product could mean serious losses for the owners. And although the slave masters could produce high-quality products, they remained slaves, and their lives depended on the will of the owners. Another place of hard labor for slaves were construction sites, where they erected magnificent Roman buildings, aqueducts, temples, bridges, amphitheaters. At such construction sites, slave labor had no days off or breaks. Slaves who worked at such sites were often engaged in lifting and carrying heavy materials, building walls, roads, and other infrastructure. These jobs required not only strength, but also endurance. Slaves often worked in extremely difficult conditions: intense heat, dust, noise, and the constant threat of injury. There was also a hierarchy on construction sites. Some slaves did lighter work, while others carried heavy logs and stones, performing tasks that were truly physical feats. Construction in ancient Rome required great effort, and the slaves who did this work had no protection or guarantee of safety. Not only was there no working day, but there was no personal life either. A slave could be replaced at any moment, and no one thought about his well-being. Having looked at the harsh conditions of slave labor in the fields and workshops, let us move on to the even more brutal reality of slavery in ancient Rome. This is a world where labor was constant physical strain, where every movement was burdened with intolerable conditions, and where the consequences of mistakes were catastrophic. A slave working in a galley or a mine was subjected to extreme physical and psychological pressure. These types of work were at the lowest rungs of the slave hierarchy, and their lives were especially terrible. The galleys and mines of ancient Rome were far from romanticized places of work. They were places where slaves were subjected to inhumane conditions, heavy physical work, threats of violence, and death. The life of these slaves was not just work, it was a test of survival. There was no rest or relief for them, and each day was a struggle with their own bodies, which gradually tired and lost strength. The places where these slaves worked had strict rules, constantly testing their physical endurance and obedience. Picture a galley, a long, battered vessel, creaking under the strain. The sun is blinding, but that only makes it hotter. The slaves who manned the oars were not only forced to work, they were brutally controlled. Slave owners and officers aboard the galleys demanded that they row tirelessly, with endless persistence and rhythm, hour after hour, day after day, with no time to rest. Galleys in ancient Rome were used for military operations, trade, and transportation. However, they were more than just ships. They were real floating slave camps. The slaves who rowed these ships did not have even the most basic comforts. Their bodies were tied to the oars. Their arms were like chains, restricting them from any attempts to rest or relax. In the worst cases, slaves were chained to their oars, and their only job was to row without slowing down. Sometimes they were forced to work all night. What was galley work like? It wasn't just physical labor, it was an endless strain on the body. Slaves worked in cramped, dark compartments, literally in cages, with no opportunity to rest. The current climate, the feeling of heat, poor ventilation, lack of fresh air, all this reduced even the last strength of the slaves to nothing. They could not sit, could not stop, and often suffered from dehydration, physical exhaustion, and fatigue. The galleys were stuffy, overcrowded, and the living conditions on them did not provide the opportunity for rest or recovery. A galley slave, unlike other forms of slavery, was closely tied to military service. These slaves, in addition to working non-stop, became part of a fighting crew. Their lives were exposed to additional danger, not only because of the brutal working conditions, but also because of the threat on the battlefield. When galleys went into battle, slaves became targets with no protection. A galley slave was not free from brutal control. Captains and guards were trained to use violence to maintain discipline. Officers on board galleys often used whips to force slaves to work faster. But that was not all. There was a strict regime on board that did not allow slaves to relax, even if they could not row. As a punishment for the slightest mistake or slowdown, they could be nailed to the oar or threatened with death. The rowers were also in mortal danger from fatigue and the diseases that spread on board. When the heat set in on the galleys, work became impossible. They rose with the oar, their bodies began to weaken, and their spirits began to dissipate. The lightning heat and stuffiness made their lives hell, and the cruel treatment by the guards only increased the stress. Often, slaves working on the galleys were subjected to punishments for the slightest infractions, such as losing their rhythm or slowing down too much. Galleys were places where executions and punishments were a daily occurrence. Slaves working on these vessels were often subjected to torture, including flogging and burning for bad behavior. These punishments served not only to maintain order, but also to break the will of the slaves, forcing them to work for long hours without a break. The work in the mines was no less harsh. Imagine what it was like to find yourself in a dark, damp dungeon, surrounded by walls with dripping water, and the air pressing heavily on your chest. Mines in ancient Rome were used to extract ores, especially silver and copper, and the slaves in these places had extremely grueling work. Every day they descended into the dark mines and began their work, which was not only difficult, but also dangerous. The slaves in the mines worked daily in conditions that could be described as hellish. They saw no light of day and had little access to fresh air. In dark tunnels, where excavations often took place in unstable conditions, they had to remove rocks, extract metals, and transport the mine gold. Work in the mine was full of dangers. Many slaves died from collapses, from poisoning by harmful fumes, or from diseases that spread in the dirty, musty rooms. In such conditions, slave labor was burdened not only with physical fatigue, but also with constant fear. As for physical labor in the mines, this was where the slaves went through the most brutal trials. With heavy tools in their hands, they broke rocks in excavations and carried out minerals. These tasks took away strength not only physically, but also psychologically, because they were constantly confined in these underground conditions, in the dark tunnels that were their home for many years. Many of them could remain in the mines for the rest of their lives, since rarely anyone could get out. Working in the mines, like on the galleys, was full of fear and pain. Slaves in these conditions often faced diseases such as tuberculosis, dysentery, and skin infections. Pollution of the water and air in the mines led to their rapid infection, which made the struggle for life even more difficult. With each passing year, the slaves lost strength, their bodies were exhausted, and their hope for salvation disappeared. Injuries and illnesses were an inevitable part of life for slaves working these hard jobs. And if they were injured, they often had no medical care. Mines and galleys were places where slaves lived by the laws of survival. Either you work or you die. In this context, slaves lived on the edge of constant existence and oblivion. The life of the galley slaves and the mine slaves was merciless and cruel. And despite the harsh conditions, these slaves remained invisible in the shadow of great Rome. Their lives served only to maintain the power of the empire, leaving no future for them. They were part of what helped Rome prosper, but they themselves never knew happiness or peace. A slave who served on a galley or worked in a mine knew only one thing. His every effort was part of an endless machine that gave him no hope for a better life. After we have looked in detail at the harsh conditions of slave labor in galleys and mines, let us talk about how an important aspect of everyday life, food, affected slaves in ancient Rome. The issue of food was one of the most brutal aspects of slaves' lives because it not only reflected their physical condition, but also symbolized their low position in the social hierarchy. In Rome, food culture was at the highest level for citizens, but slaves, whose existence was linked to endless labor, were always faced with the scarcity and modesty of food to feed themselves. The food of slaves was a symbol of their subordination, their struggle for survival, and an integral part of their brutal reality. What did slaves eat? What did those who provided for the life of a huge empire eat, but could not afford luxury or excess themselves? In this segment, we will examine slave nutrition in detail and show how poor nutrition and food shortages affected their health, endurance, and ability to work. If we imagine a slave's breakfast in ancient Rome, it would most likely be a simple piece of black bread, perhaps with a little water or milk. In the early hours of the morning, slaves had no opportunity to enjoy fancy meals. They lived mainly on what was available and could be prepared quickly. Bread was usually coarse and hard, often black, made from cheap grains such as barley or oats, with impurities added to make the bread more filling but less tasty. Sometimes the bread could be stale, and its texture became so hard that it had to be soaked in water or liquid to be swallowed. Bread was often accompanied by modest side dishes, such as vegetables or legumes, such as lentils or peas. The diet was simple and provided the necessary carbohydrates and proteins, but it was far from what could be called a complete, balanced diet. Essentially, slaves ate to survive, and nothing more. Food did not bring pleasure or satisfaction, but was merely a means to maintain their strength to continue working. Often, slaves ate a small amount of olive oil as a side dish, which was common in Rome, as well as vegetables such as turnips, cabbage, or onions. However, this diet was not always available. Many slaves did not receive such portions of food every day. The foods that slaves could eat depended on where they worked, on wealthy farms, in the homes of aristocrats, or in the harsher conditions of galleys and mines. When it comes to meat, we begin to understand how modest the eating habits of slaves were. Unlike wealthy Romans, slaves did not have constant access to meat. In ancient Rome, meat was considered an expensive and high-calorie product that only aristocrats, patricians, and free citizens could enjoy. Slaves, for the most part, did not have access to meat, and it only appeared in their diet occasionally, on special occasions, or when their masters organized big holidays. When slaves were given meat, it was most likely poultry, pork, or even duck or chicken feet. At best, the meat might be part of a soup or stew, allowing it to be spread over several servings. However, this was a rare event, and slaves generally ate what they could find or make from simple, cheap ingredients. Fruit was also rare in the slave diet. Fruit was common in Rome, but its availability depended on the season and region. In rural areas, slaves might occasionally pick fruit from trees, such as apples, pears, or grapes, but this was also the exception, not the norm. Furthermore, even when they could obtain fruit, slaves were generally not allowed to enjoy it in sufficient quantities. Fruit was not just a delicacy, but part of an agrarian economy, and its value in the markets was too great to allow poor slaves to enjoy it without restriction. Thus, the lack of meat and fruit was an important aspect of being a slave. Not only was the food poor and meager, but it also did not allow slaves to maintain the physical health necessary for heavy workloads. Water, without which it is impossible to survive, was of course available to slaves, but not always in sufficient quantities. Slaves often had to drink water from public sources or even from wells located far from their workplaces. The water they drank was often dirty and polluted, which led to various diseases and ailments. This was one of the factors that accelerated the deterioration of slaves' health and shortened their lifespan. Water, of course, could not compensate for the nutritional deficiencies that existed in the slaves' diet, but it was necessary for their bodies to function and perform hard work. Working in mines or on construction sites required enormous physical effort from slaves, and in these conditions, food became a vital part of their existence. However, the food here was also extremely poor. For example, on construction sites, slaves often received only small portions of food at lunchtime, which could not provide them with the strength to continue working. Food in such conditions consisted mainly of bread and water, and sometimes cheap vegetables or legumes were given, which served only to maintain survival. Conditions in the mines were particularly difficult. Working in the mines, where the air was heavy and the space was cramped and dirty, took all the strength out of the slaves. In these conditions, food became not just a means of survival, but a necessity that allowed the slaves to somehow maintain their strength to continue working. However, as in the case of the galleys, the food was minimal and could not satisfy all the needs of the body. The lack of adequate nutrition and vitamins in the slaves' diets led to serious illnesses. Poor nutrition weakened the slaves' immunity, making them more vulnerable to infections and diseases. They were particularly hard hit by diseases such as scurvy, a deficiency of vitamin C, dysentery, and colds, which often spread in conditions where there were no proper sanitary conditions. A simple diet of bread and water did not provide the slaves with the necessary nutrients for their bodies to function properly. This, in turn, accelerated their physical deterioration and made their ability to work even more limited. Diseases associated with poor nutrition made slaves vulnerable, and they were often neglected in the Roman slave system. Slaves who were sick or weak often had no opportunity to recover, as their labor was necessary, and replacing their ability to work meant additional expenses for their masters. Now that we've explored the harsh conditions slaves endured in various fields, from the fields to the workshops to the galleys and mines, let's turn our attention to how slaves in ancient Rome participated in more flamboyant and public events. Although they were the ones who kept the vast empire running, their lives were often closely tied to Rome's public events, from gladiatorial combat to theater performances and athletic competitions. Filled with luxury and spectacle, these events could be either a chance for a few minutes of glory for slaves, or an excruciating ordeal in which they had no choice. In terms of Roman social norms, slaves always remained in the role of service elements, those who provided comfort and entertainment for free citizens. However, their participation in these events was not limited to support. Slaves became part of the action itself. We will see how they were used in gladiatorial combat, on the stage, and in other forms of entertainment that the Romans loved so much. Gladiatorial combat is perhaps the most famous element of Roman culture associated with slaves. These brutal contests, in which fighters fought to the death in front of an enthusiastic crowd, were not just entertainment, but a real spectacle that attracted thousands of spectators. Unlike modern sports, gladiatorial combat was not a competition aimed at demonstrating strength and skill. It was a bloody, brutal battle where winners and losers were determined not only by skill, but also by simple survival. For slaves, participation in gladiatorial combat was a tragic fate. Many of them became gladiators because of their status. When a slave entered a gladiatorial school, Latin ludus, he became part of a system that trained fighters for the fighting arenas. In these schools, experienced trainers worked with him, teaching him all the techniques of combat. This was not just a physical test, but also a psychological one. The slave had to learn not only to win, but also to survive the cruelty of trainers, who often resorted to punishment and torture in order to harden their charges. A gladiator was usually a slave or a criminal condemned to death. He had no choice. If he survived the arena, he might be freed, but this was extremely rare. Most gladiators died in combat, and their deaths became part of the spectacle. However, even if a slave won, his freedom was in question. Gladiators, although they gained some glory among Roman citizens, remained property. Their victories were important to their masters, but not to the fighters themselves. What was it like to be a gladiator? It was not just a fight for life, it was daily training that took away the last of one's strength. It was cruel discipline and humiliation, accompanied by suffering and the impossibility of refusing to participate in fights. For slaves forced to become gladiators, it was a fate from which there was no escape. Gladiatorial combats were a mandatory element of public events in Rome, and for slaves they became a kind of escape from everyday life. However, this escape was associated with a huge price: the loss of humanity, fights to the death, and cruel punishments. In ancient Rome, the theater was no less an element of public life than gladiatorial combat. Performances on the stages of Roman theaters were popular among all classes of the population, and slaves often played key roles on these stages, as well as provided services during the performances. Theaters filled with Roman spectators were the place where not only spectacular performances unfolded, but also the hidden lives of slaves standing behind the scenes, outside of the theater. A slave who worked in a theater could be either an actor or a service worker. Slave actors trained in the art of theater participated in productions, where they often played the roles of slaves, animals, or other lowly characters. These roles, despite their importance, were still limited by the status of the slave. Slaves, as a rule, could not gain freedom simply for acting. Even if a slave acted in popular plays or on the stage, his life remained subordinate to his masters. However, working in the theater could be even worse than working in other fields. The theater was a place where slaves were often subjected to public humiliation and cruelty. If an actor was inattentive or did not perform his role well, punishments were inevitable. In addition to actors, slaves held other important roles on the stage. They were costume designers, stage designers, assistant directors, and even lighting technicians. Working in the theater, as in other fields, required special discipline, endurance, and the ability to work without interruption. The life of a theater slave was full of labor and suffering, which took place in full view of the entire city. Another place where slaves were in the spotlight was at athletic competitions and other public events held in circuses. These spectacular events attracted large crowds, and although most slaves were employed in less visible roles, maintenance, preparation of facilities, and maintenance of order, some became pure athletes, participants in athletic tournaments. In Rome, there were chariot races, gladiator fights, and various forms of athletic competitions in which slaves participated as athletes or as servants providing training. However, for most slaves, working in such events was not about their own success or achievement. These slaves, who were engaged in preparing the arenas, caring for the animals, providing the technical side of the show, worked at full capacity. But it was the spectacle they created for the audience that became the backdrop against which their helplessness was hidden. They may have been part of the show, but they never became its true participants. Many slaves in ancient Rome took part in organizing and supporting major public events such as feasts, parades, festivals, and religious ceremonies. They were not just observers of these events, but actively helped organize them. Slaves were used to work as servants, guards, cooks, and service personnel at all kinds of public events. Imagine huge banquets where rich patricians feast, drink, and have fun, while slaves stand in the shadows and serve them. They pour wine, serve food, clean dishes, and ensure impeccable order. Slaves had to be always ready to serve any guest, fulfill any request of the masters, and not ask questions. They were not participants in the feasts or celebrations. They were the ones who created the atmosphere, but remained invisible to the spectators. The importance of these events for the slaves was that, despite their subordination and dependence, they became part of the vibrant and memorable life of Rome, but their personal feelings and experiences remained overshadowed by the bustle of the festivities and the noise of satisfied spectators. After looking at the conditions of slaves in the fields, workshops, galleys, and theaters, let's delve into an important topic that affected their entire existence in ancient Rome: punishments and duties. In an environment where every step and every movement of a slave was strictly controlled, his life was filled not only with work, but also with the constant fear of punishment for the slightest mistake. Understanding what punishments awaited slaves in case of failure to fulfill their duties helps us to understand their position in society more deeply. A slave was not just a workforce performing tasks for the benefit of their masters. They were property, and their lives were at the mercy of the will of their owner. All their actions, whether it was their work, their interactions with other slaves, or even their simple behavior in everyday life, were closely monitored. The system of punishment that existed in ancient Rome was both cruel and all-powerful. The slightest violation of established norms or mistakes in work led to severe consequences, which were part of the system of control over slaves. Slaves, despite their obligations, could not count on protection from violence and abuse, which was often part of their daily reality. For slaves in ancient Rome, their duties weren't just jobs, they were defining moments in their lives. They woke up each morning knowing they were in for a long day of physical and emotional strain. Slaves were tasked with seemingly endless tasks: cleaning, cooking, caring for animals, working in workshops, and on construction sites. These duties were an integral part of their existence, and there was no room for error in their execution. Lack of precision in work could lead to punishments. A slave serving the masters in the house had to watch every move, every step. In any house or farm where a slave did his job, there was always strict control. The slave had to clean before the masters woke up. He had to be ready to serve food if the masters needed it, and he had to fulfill all the requirements without delay. Any mistake, whether a broken vase, spoiled food, or a slow work performance, could always lead to punishment. Slaves who worked in the fields or workshops faced similar demands. In agriculture, there was strict discipline. If, for example, the harvest was not collected on time, or the work in the field was not done as the owner demanded, this also entailed punishment. Slaves who worked on construction sites were also monitored at every stage of the work, and here mistakes could cost lives, especially if they led to accidents. Inexperience or carelessness in the performance of one's duties often resulted not only in punishment, but in much more serious consequences. Failure to complete a task or to perform a job incorrectly became synonymous with failure, which was followed by punishment. The brutality of Roman punishments was an integral part of the slave system. Unlike other cultures, where punishments for misdeeds might be less severe, in ancient Rome, slaves could be subjected to punishments that were not only painful, but also humiliating. For their masters, slaves were not just labor. They were property that could be punished if they did not perform their duties properly. One of the most common punishments was flogging. A slave could be flogged for the slightest mistake, be it a broken dish, a sloppy job, or a delay in completing tasks. The flogging could take place in front of other slaves, which served as a warning to others, showing what consequences awaited them for a mistake. But flogging was only a light form of punishment. For more serious violations, there were more drastic measures. For example, slaves could be sent to hard labor or to mines, where working conditions were much more brutal and dangerous. Not only were these jobs extremely physically demanding, but they were also life-threatening. Slaves who were sent to such jobs were subject to serious injuries, and many died in the process. There were also more brutal punishments, such as crucifixion. This punishment was used if a slave ran away or committed a serious crime, such as rebellion against his masters. Crucifixion was not only a public act, but also a humiliating way of death that served as a deterrent example to other slaves. Despite its effectiveness in control, crucifixion left permanent scars on the minds of both slaves and society as a whole. Another punishment was execution. Slaves who were seriously misbehaving or rebellious could be executed on the spot, with public executions being held so that everyone could see what awaited each slave who tried to disturb the peace. In addition to physical violence, slaves in ancient Rome had to face constant psychological pressure. They were forced to live in conditions of constant fear and anxiety for their lives, their safety, and their loved ones. A slave who was deprived of freedom did not even have the right to his own opinion. All his actions, even in the most intimate situations, were controlled by the owners. This created a feeling of powerlessness and uncertainty about the future in slaves. Slaves were forced to live in a constant state of tension, as their lives depended on the whims of their masters. Even minor infractions, such as misbehaving at parties or failing to complete tasks, could lead to punishment. This psychological abuse was so profound that many slaves at some point ceased to recognize their own value and viewed themselves solely as tools in the hands of their masters. Constant psychological pressure was the most effective weapon that the masters used to subjugate the slaves. It was not only physical pain, but also moral humiliation. It was difficult for slaves to find a place to rest or quiet time for reflection, for they were always under strict control. A slave could not afford a mistake, could not be responsible for his actions, for any disrespect for the masters or delay in completing the work could become a reason for punishment. Although slaves in ancient Rome often had no rights, this does not mean that they always remained passive and submissive. Throughout the history of Rome, there were several major slave rebellions that became symbols of resistance and the fight for freedom. The most famous of these is the rebellion of Spartacus, who, as a gladiator, led a slave rebellion against Rome in 73 BC. Spartacus's rebellion lasted for several years and became a real test for the Roman Empire. However, such rebellions were always brutally suppressed. The rebellious slaves, although they were able to achieve significant success for a time, were ultimately defeated. Spartacus and his troops, despite a desperate fight, were captured, and many of his followers were crucified. This rebellion became a clear example of how cruel punishments and the suppression of freedom became part of the system of slavery in ancient Rome. However, despite the constant violence and suppression, the idea of resistance, rebellion, and the fight for freedom remained in the hearts of many slaves, and each instance of struggle became a reminder that there was at least a spark of hope in their lives. Slavery in ancient Rome had many sides, and one of the most subtle but vital was the work slaves did outside of their luxurious homes where they carried out their daily duties. While we are used to imagining slaves working indoors, in the kitchen, in the bedroom, in the garden, outside the home, they performed equally important work, which was not only associated with physical labor, but also with the need to maintain the viability of the entire infrastructure of Rome. Laborers who worked outside the home, in public and private buildings, on construction sites, or in organizing the city's infrastructure, were central to the existence of Rome. Although their lives were hidden from the eyes of most citizens, it was these slaves who kept the empire running smoothly. They built roads, constructed aqueducts, erected bridges, and maintained the systems that made Rome the prosperous and powerful city it was. Let's take a closer look at what kind of work slaves did outside of private homes, how it affected their lives, and how they were responsible for the work that kept Rome great. One of the most important aspects of slave life outside the home was construction. Rome's roads, which connected it to the far reaches of the empire, were not just structures but vital elements of its military, economic, and social power. The construction of these roads was done using slave labor, which was not only a physical but also an administrative challenge. Slaves were used to prepare the ground, dig ditches, lay stones, and build bridges. The work was not only physically demanding but also dangerous. Slaves had to work in extremely hot or rainy conditions with no chance to rest. Their tools were primitive, and the building materials, stones and bricks, required enormous effort to process and transport. A slave who worked on road construction spent long hours bending over and lifting heavy objects, breathing in dust and dirt. Beyond the hardships of the work itself, there were other dangers. Slaves had to deal with dangers from rock falls, from falling from heights while working on bridges, and sometimes inadequate safety at the construction site. Many slaves died while building roads, and their deaths were not uncommon. It was not just work, it was survival under constant threat. It is important to note, however, that road building in Rome was not limited to physical labor. The slaves who worked in this field were not only engaged in carrying loads, but also had to adhere to strict construction standards that were part of Roman engineering. Slaves had to work not only with stones, but also with aqueducts that pumped water over long distances. These structures, being essential elements of Rome's infrastructure, also required a great deal of effort on the part of slaves. Slaves working on such projects were essentially ensuring the viability of the entire Roman civilization. And despite their importance, their work remained invisible and unappreciated. The work of slaves in the construction of aqueducts is another striking example of how the labor of these people kept the city alive, and their efforts were never properly appreciated. Aqueducts were vital to Rome, as they provided the city with water for drinking, for irrigation, and for the functioning of the baths, which were an important part of Roman culture. The slaves who worked on these large construction projects provided the labor to build tunnels, dig canals, and create and strengthen stone structures. These gigantic structures required enormous effort and long months, sometimes years of work. The slaves who built the aqueducts had to work in incredibly difficult conditions. Given that the aqueducts were often built underground or through mountain ranges, their work was not only physically difficult, but also psychologically difficult, as they did not see sunlight for long periods of time and worked in mud and dampness. Building aqueducts became one of the most difficult and dangerous jobs slaves were involved in. They dug deep ditches, installing stone blocks and pipes, often exposing themselves to injury or illness. Despite the importance of these slaves' work in maintaining Rome's water supply, their labor remained invisible. The slaves were merely construction workers who received no thanks for their efforts. For them, the aqueduct was not only a physical structure, but also a symbol of how their efforts were used to maintain the great Roman civilization, without them being able to feel the significance of their work. In addition to roads and aqueducts, slaves also worked on construction sites to build magnificent buildings and structures such as temples, arches, and amphitheaters. These construction projects served not only a functional purpose, but were also signs of Rome's glory, grandeur, and power. The slaves who worked on such projects helped create Rome as we know it, majestic, but also idealized in the eyes of future generations. The work on the construction sites also required enormous effort and skill. The slaves who worked in such conditions not only carried building materials, but also worked in workshops, creating parts for architectural structures, decorating temples with marble statues, or helping to assemble mechanical parts for carnival processions. They built magnificent structures that became symbols of Rome. However, none of these buildings remembered their names. No statue praised their work. Work on construction sites was also associated with high mortality. Injuries from lifting heavy materials, falls from heights, rock falls, all of this became part of the daily existence of slaves working on construction sites. However, these deaths remained insignificant in the eyes of the owners. For slaves, life was simply a tool without meaning. In addition to building roads and aqueducts, slaves performed other jobs that kept Rome running. For example, they worked on building theaters, amphitheaters, stadiums, and even columns. All of these structures required a huge amount of labor, and slaves were the ones who built them. In addition, slaves maintained order in markets, public baths, and during various holidays. They ensured cleanliness, order, maintenance of buildings and streets. Without their labor, Roman streets and buildings could not function normally because slaves provided not only construction, but also maintenance of the daily needs of society. The unpaid work of slaves was the driving force of the Roman economy, and their efforts went unnoticed. They were part of a huge machine that worked without interruption, creating Rome as a symbol of civilization, but they themselves had no right to recognition. Now that we have covered in detail how slaves performed their duties outside of private homes, let us delve into one of the most complex and multifaceted topics of slave life in ancient Rome: their relationship with their masters. Slaves in the Roman Empire were not only working hands, but also completely dependent creatures, deprived of almost all rights and freedoms. This dependence manifested itself in everything from cruel punishments for the slightest mistake to privileges that could be given only to the most valuable slaves. The relationship between slaves and their masters was often one of cruel control, but there were also subtle moments in these relationships when the masters could show mercy, or, on the contrary, increase their power. Sometimes a slave could almost become a member of the family, and sometimes he was just an instrument, deprived of any human dignity. How did the lives of slaves survive in such conditions? And how did they survive in conditions of constant fear and subordination? Let's figure out how the cruelty and privileges of the masters affected the fate of slaves in ancient Rome. For most slaves, their relationship with their masters was one of constant violence, both physical and psychological. Masters, having absolute power over their slaves, often used their power to maintain brutal order and discipline. For them, slaves were not fully human, but rather instruments of labor. The severity of these relationships often went beyond simple punishment for negligence or failure to follow orders. Slaves could be subjected to brutal torture in order to demonstrate their subordinate position and remind them of their low status in society. One of the most common punishments for slaves was beatings. Slaves who did not perform their duties properly or did not comply with the orders of their masters were subjected to severe beatings. These punishments were carried out in public places so that all other slaves could see the consequences of disobedience. In some cases, masters would order their slaves to wear iron collars, which served as a reminder of their status. These collars were not only physically painful, but also symbolized complete humiliation. There were other forms of punishment. For example, slaves could be sent to work in mines or quarries, where working conditions were horrific, and the chances of survival were minimal. This was a doubly cruel punishment, not only physical, but also psychological, since many slaves would have preferred to die on the spot than to endure years spent in such inhumane conditions. Slaves who were most loyal to their masters or valuable as specialists could avoid direct physical violence. However, there was always room for violence in Roman culture, and even if slaves were not beaten, they had to endure moral pressure and humiliation. Fear of the master was a constant companion of their lives, and this fear was always part of their psychological state. However, the life of slaves in the Roman Empire was not always exclusively cruel. There were cases when slave owners showed mercy or granted privileges to their slaves. Such privileges most often applied to slaves who were highly valued by their masters, such as personal servants, child caregivers, or craftsmen working in workshops. These slaves could receive more comfortable living conditions, the same food as their masters, and sometimes even better clothing. In these cases, their status approached that of a trusted servant, and they sometimes had more rights than other slaves performing manual labor. In addition, such slaves often lived in more comfortable and protected places, in special rooms inside the owner's house, often near their living quarters. Sometimes they could even sit at the table with the owners, participate in social events, and their opinion was valued more than that of other slaves. Moreover, some slaves might have the opportunity to buy their freedom. This was rare, but if a slave demonstrated outstanding ability, was trustworthy, and provided income to his masters, he might be freed. Freeing slaves could be the result of special merit, such as military service or significant contributions to the master's family business. Freed slaves sometimes became clients of their masters and could continue to work for them, but now under more favorable conditions. This process was known as manumissio. Freeing slaves was an important step in their lives. It gave them a chance to start a new life, but that life was often difficult. Even freed slaves remained in a low social position and had a hard time making their way in society. Despite this, the idea of being able to gain freedom became a source of strength and motivation for many slaves. The relationship between a slave and his master depended on a number of factors: what kind of slave the master was, what expectations both parties had, and what level of trust arose between them. These were, in essence, economic relations, where the slave was not just a person, but a workforce capable of generating profit. However, there were often difficult moments in the relations between slaves and masters. For example, slave owners, wanting to increase their income, could use slaves to work in a variety of areas. They could require their slaves not only to perform their basic duties, but also to show creativity in order to help the masters achieve success in various fields, from trade to art. In such cases, the slave became not just a worker, but part of the strategic line of the masters. Moreover, not all masters treated their slaves in the same way. Some could be cruel, while others treated their slaves with respect, provided that they performed their duties well. However, despite the differences in approach, the basic rule remained the same. Slaves always remained property, deprived of rights. Relationships with masters also affected issues of status and social mobility. The Roman Empire had a rigid social hierarchy, and slaves were always at the bottom of this hierarchy. However, despite this, relationships with masters could in certain cases be not only work-related, but also personal. Slave owners who valued their slaves could build trusting relationships with them. In such cases, a slave became almost a member of the family, could participate in important events, and help with the personal affairs of the owners. There were also cases where slaves became so valuable to their masters that they even tried to give them opportunities for advancement. For example, slaves who worked in government affairs or were part of elite spheres, such as secretaries or craftsmen, could gain access to information related to the political and social life of Rome. This trust did not extend to all slaves, but in some cases, it became the basis for improving their living conditions. However, all these privileges did not have a long-term effect. Slaves always remained in a dependent position, and their lives depended on the will of their masters. Now that we have explored in detail how slaves existed under the Roman Empire, let us move on to one of the most emotionally charged topics in the lives of slaves: their struggle for freedom. Freedom for slaves was not just an abstract idea or a dream, it was a vital aspiration, sometimes the only source of hope and strength for those who felt that their lives were hopeless and cruel. But the path to freedom was not only long and arduous, it was often virtually impossible for most slaves. Yet, despite systemic oppression and a lack of real opportunities, the quest for freedom was not only a dream, but also a realistic goal for many slaves, whether through ransom, rebellion, or gaining freedom from their masters. But what were these paths to freedom, and how accessible were they for slaves in ancient Rome? What real opportunities existed for slaves to become free, and how did this affect their daily lives? One of the most common paths to freedom for slaves was the process of ransom, known as manumission. This process gave slaves a chance to free themselves, but it was extremely difficult, and not all slaves had the opportunity or the means to do so. For slaves who were not physically exhausted or unable to work, ransom could be a realistic goal to which they aspired, despite the difficulties. The process of redemption was difficult and took a long time. In order to buy his freedom, a slave had to save up money, which became extremely difficult since slaves did not receive payment for their work, except for food and minimal provisions. In some cases, slaves could count on the help of other slaves, or even the support of the owners if they believed the slave deserved freedom. It is important to note that the ransoming of slaves was a partial illusion of freedom. When a slave became free, he still remained part of the lower class of Roman society. He did not become a full citizen, and his life remained restricted in many ways. He had no political rights and often continued to work for the same masters, but now under conditions that did not involve direct dependence. This underscored how difficult it was for slaves to achieve true freedom and integration into society, even if they formally became free men. For slaves who were able to buy their freedom, there was also a paradoxical situation. They were freed, but the world they entered was often no less hostile. Existence without the status and support of masters meant complete social isolation. Many of those who were freed found that they now had to fight again for a place in society that they could never count on. Some slaves could expect to be freed by demonstrating loyalty and trust from their masters. If a slave proved himself to be a valuable assistant or employee, he could become a favorite of his masters, which in some cases led to gradual liberation. Especially in cases such as service in the government apparatus, in the army, or as a personal secretary, a slave could earn a certain respect, and the masters could appreciate his work and even grant him freedom. However, even in such cases, the slave did not become a full citizen. He remained economically and socially dependent on others, often bound by obligations or debts. Although such slave owners could declare slaves free, in practice this often meant that the slave remained in a dependent position, but with formal freedom that did not give him real rights in society. In some cases, slaves who served in private households or institutions could expect to be freed through long-term loyalty to their masters. However, such accidental liberations were extremely rare. Only the best of the slaves had a chance at freedom, and even then it did not always mean that they could start a new life. Even after their liberation, their options were severely limited. In the history of ancient Rome, several slave revolts became significant moments in the struggle for freedom. However, the revolt did not always represent a real chance for most slaves, and often became a tragedy in which no one became free, and most slaves died. Despite these sad results, slave revolts, such as Spartacus's revolt in 73 BC, became symbols of hope for many slaves. Spartacus, a gladiator and slave, led a rebellion that gathered a huge army of slaves who decided to escape their cruel masters and fight for their freedom. This rebellion brought glory to his name and to the name of those who followed him, but despite its successes, it ended in complete defeat, and the rebellious slaves were brutally punished. Spartacus's rebellion became a symbol of how difficult it was to win freedom when the system of slavery was so deeply rooted in society. Yet, despite their defeat, slave rebellions brought the issue of slavery to the forefront and signaled that slaves could not be mere tools in the hands of their masters. In a way, the rebellions became expressions of a desperate struggle for freedom, even though they never had a real chance of winning. For many slaves, the path to freedom was not only a physical, but also a psychological obstacle. The psychological effects of long periods of slavery were so strong that many slaves could not imagine life outside the slave system. The trauma of slavery had a profound effect on the psyche. A slave who had spent years in subjection could not always rebuild his consciousness to a new way of life, even if he became free. The loss of freedom in the physical sense often meant that a person remained a slave in his soul, not believing in the possibility of a full life. For many slaves, life in conditions of severe dependence became the norm, and the very idea of freedom seemed something unrealistic. Even in cases where slaves received a chance for liberation, they faced deep social isolation and a lack of direction for further development. Their lives remained limited, and even freedom did not always become a symbol of complete independence. Despite these harsh conditions, the desire for freedom was not just an internal urge. It became part of Roman culture. Slavery was systemic in the Roman Empire, and it permeated the very fabric of society. Slaves, being an important part of this society, always dreamed of breaking free from their lot and gaining freedom. Sometimes freedom meant not only an end to physical slavery, but also the opportunity to lead a more independent life, to follow one's own desires and ambitions. But even for free people who had somehow tied their lives to slavery, liberation was a dream that often remained out of reach. Having explored in detail how slaves sought freedom and tried to change their fate, let us now turn our attention to a less visible but no less important part of their lives: the negative aspects of their existence. The life of slaves in ancient Rome, despite their physical efforts, privileges, or dreams of freedom, was unbearably hard and full of fear, pain, and humiliation. A slave, deprived of rights, freedom, and dignity, was condemned to a life of subordination, lack of choice, and constant threat of punishment. Slavery in ancient Rome was not a static phenomenon. It was a brutal and complex system that supported a vast empire, but also destroyed the lives of millions of people. It was the brutal conditions of slavery, the humiliation, the chronic labor, the lack of a voice, and the feeling of constant threat that became the catalyst for many slave rebellions, which in turn became an important part of Roman history. Let's delve into those aspects of slave life that help us understand why their discontent and suffering often became the source of rebellions and uprisings. The life of slaves in Rome was nothing but an endless struggle. Every day was filled with work that did not give them a break. Even if a slave was granted some privileges or led a relatively easy life in the house of his masters, his life was still cruel. A slave could not rest, could not dream of a weekend, or even a rest after a long day of work. His life was subordinated not only to physical labor, but also to constant surveillance of his every step, word, and action. A slave, whether in the house, in the field, or in the workshop, was always on the alert. He had to be always ready to carry out the orders of his masters, sometimes in the most difficult conditions, even if his body was exhausted. From early morning until late at night, a slave knew no rest. Their days were filled with monotonous work, which they were obliged to perform without the right to make a mistake. The lack of choice in a slave's life sometimes became unbearable. Slaves, unlike free citizens, had no control over their lives. They could not seek better work, change masters, or even decide when to rest or work. They were subordinate. And this subordination encompassed not only physical life, but also personal feelings. A slave could not have personal relationships, start a family without the permission of his masters, and even if he was successful in his work, this did not guarantee him better conditions. One of the most difficult aspects of the life of slaves in ancient Rome was the humiliation they suffered. A slave was not just a tool to work with. He was an object, a property that could be disposed of as one saw fit. The system of slavery in Rome gave the masters absolute power. Slaves had no right to their own things, their bodies, their lives. Everything belonged to the masters. This humiliation was not only physical, but also psychological. Slaves could be sold, bartered, punished, and even killed if the master deemed it necessary. Slaves had no legal protection, and their rights, if they existed at all, were virtually non-existent. A slave could be beaten or punished for any minor offense, and punishments for mistakes often went beyond what could be considered fair. Humiliation was part of their daily lives, and often became part of their sense of self. Slaves who lived in conditions where their dignity was not respected could lose faith in their own strength and abilities. Even when a slave was a valuable helper in a household, or a master in a craftsman's workshop, he was still an object without rights. His position did not allow him to be a full member of society, and often even the most privileged slaves realized that their lives depended on the will of their masters. This awareness of the lack of a way out sometimes became a cause of oppression and despair. For most slaves, life in Rome was an endless struggle for survival. Even if they worked in relatively favorable conditions, their status remained low, and their prospects for the future were virtually non-existent. Slaves were not allowed to think about personal plans or dream of anything more. If a slave could buy his freedom, it was the exception, not the rule. However, even in these conditions of slavery, especially among those who worked in workshops or taught children, there was a small hope for improvement. Sometimes the masters gave the slave the opportunity to earn money or gave additional opportunities so that the worker could buy himself out. But such cases were rare, and for the most part, the slaves realized that they had no future and that any mistake could lead to punishment or death. The life of slaves did not allow them to build relationships with the outside world. This not only deprived them of inner freedom, but also destroyed their emotions and psyche. Psychological exhaustion, depression, and despair were frequent companions of slaves because they could not count on support from either society or the authorities. Most often, they lived in conditions of hopelessness without the ability to count on changing their fate. Many of them got used to the idea that freedom is something unattainable, and their lives are just a cycle that has no way out. It is not surprising that such living conditions for slaves gave rise to rebellions. Despite strict control measures, slaves sought ways to express their discontent and protest against the system that oppressed them. The history of Rome knows several major slave rebellions, the most famous of which was the rebellion of Spartacus. This rebellion, which began in 73 BC, became one of the most striking examples of slaves fighting for their freedom. Spartacus, the gladiator who led the revolt, was the embodiment of hope for the slaves. The revolt spread across Italy and involved tens of thousands of slaves who sought to free themselves from oppression. The slaves who rebelled showed great determination and were briefly successful, but the system of slavery in Rome was too strong to be destroyed by a single revolt. After years of fighting, the rebellion was brutally suppressed, and the rebel slaves themselves were killed or crucified along the Appian Way, a grim reminder of the price of resistance. Spartacus's rebellion, though a failure, symbolized the lengths to which slaves would go in search of their freedom. After the rebellion was suppressed, the Roman authorities took harsh measures to destroy any resistance among the slaves. Public executions, crucifixions, physical punishments, and cruel punishments became part of the system of suppression. It was difficult for slaves to think about resistance because every attempt to rebel led to tragic consequences. However, despite all these cruelties, slave rebellions did not cease. Small rebellions, minor uprisings, desperate attempts to escape and hide from the masters continued throughout the history of Rome. The slaves, who suffered humiliation and deprivation, still did not stop fighting for their freedom, because for them it was not only a physical, but also a moral protest against a system that did not give them the right to human dignity. When we look at the Roman Empire, we cannot help but marvel at its grandeur. Magnificent buildings, powerful armies, complex political structures, a rich culture, and philosophy. But beneath all this lies a dark, brutal reality that allowed Rome to exist in its form for so many centuries. This is the reality of slavery, a complex and tragic system that was an integral part of the empire's daily life. Slavery in ancient Rome was not just an institution. It was a mechanism that supported the empire's economy, culture, and social fabric. Now that we have looked in detail at how slaves worked, what they experienced, how they strove for freedom, and how their lives were subject to cruelty and humiliation, let's look at how slavery in the Roman Empire left an indelible mark on history, how it affected the society and culture of the time, and what lessons we can learn from this dark part of history. Slavery in ancient Rome was not just a social institution, but an integral part of the economy. Slaves provided the basic functions that supported the life of the city and the entire empire. Their labor was a vital element in agriculture, construction, trade, craft workshops, and households. Roman roads, aqueducts, majestic amphitheaters, temples, and the entire urban infrastructure could not exist without the labor of slaves. Slave labor allowed the Roman elite not only to enjoy luxury, but also to meet the needs of a vast empire. Agriculture, which was the backbone of the economy, depended on the labor of slaves who worked the land, grew the grain, harvested the crops, and tended the animals. It was physically taxing and a constant strain on the slaves, but without their labor, Rome could not have existed as a vast empire. Instead of delegating these tasks to free citizens, Rome based its success on slaves. Slavery was also the basis for many of Rome's cultural achievements. Slaves in workshops created magnificent statues, architectural designs, and works of art that became symbols of Roman civilization. Many famous Roman sculptures, paintings, and architectural elements were the result of slave labor, which, unlike the artists and craftsmen of the time, did not receive recognition. They did not create art for themselves, but for others, often not even having the right to sign their works. Slavery in ancient Rome not only supported the economy, but also had a profound effect on the psychology of society. In a society where slaves made up a significant part of the working population, attitudes towards them varied. For wealthy Romans, slaves were simply part of the household. Their fate and needs did not concern their owners. Even if slaves served for many years as tutors or personal assistants, they always remained on the lowest rung of the social ladder. This division into higher and lower was fundamental to the Roman system. There was a clear hierarchy in society in which a slave was lower than a free person. The culture and ideology of Rome justified slavery as a natural state for a certain group of people. In exchange for physical labor, slaves did not receive physical or psychological comfort. They were not members of society. They were not individuals. Psychological isolation and slavery became part of life in Rome, and many slaves, forced to submit to this system, lost their own inner world. This had an impact on Roman political culture, where concepts of justice and human rights were completely divorced from the reality of slavery. Even philosophers and thinkers such as Seneca and Cicero often viewed slaves as lesser and freedom as a privilege available only to the wealthy and respected members of society. While Roman citizens enjoyed civil rights, slaves were owned as property, with no recognition of their rights or voice. The inability to escape the slave system became the cause of several major slave rebellions, the most famous of which was the rebellion of Spartacus. Spartacus, a former gladiator, became a symbol of rebellion against slavery and the cruelty of the masters. The rebellion, which began with a small group of gladiators, quickly grew into a large army of slaves, which fought successfully against the Roman army. However, despite their determination, the rebellion was suppressed, and Spartacus and his followers died. This rebellion was just one example of how slavery led to protests and attempts to free themselves. Slave rebellions, although they ended tragically for the slaves, showed not only the cruelty of the system, but also the humanity of slaves striving for a better future. Even after the failure of the rebellions, the spirit of resistance continued to live in the hearts of slaves. It was not only a confrontation with cruel power, but also a protest against the idea that a person can be deprived of all rights based on his social status. The legacy of slavery in ancient Rome remains an important part of world history. The Roman Empire, despite its size and achievements, could not exist without the slaves who formed its backbone. Slavery became not only an economic foundation, but also part of the social structure, influencing the social views, philosophy, and morality of the time. Although the Roman Empire eventually fell, the system of slavery continued to exist in various forms in medieval Europe and elsewhere. Many of our modern views on labor, human rights, and social justice grew out of reflections on slavery. Those who fought to free slaves formed the philosophical and legal foundations that underpinned the fight for human rights. Slavery in ancient Rome was one of the darkest examples of inequality in history, but its realization served as a catalyst for change to recognize the rights of every human being. The lives of slaves in ancient Rome have left their mark on human history, and many lessons from this era are still relevant today. The slaves' quest for freedom, their fight for dignity, and the brutality of the slave system remind us of the importance of fighting for the rights and freedoms of all people. The history of slavery in ancient Rome does not end with the fall of the empire. Today we continue to fight forms of slavery, inequality, and exploitation. And this fight must not forget the lessons of the past. Slavery in Rome was an important part of the development of human civilization, despite its cruelty. It left us with lessons about the importance of protecting the rights of every person, regardless of their social status or origin. It is important to remember that despite Rome's greatness and achievements, the system of slavery was its dark side, leaving an indelible mark on history. As we conclude our study of slavery in ancient Rome, it is important to note how this system left its mark on history and how it formed the social, economic, and philosophical foundations for future eras. Although slavery in Rome was devastating and painful for millions of people, its effects had a profound impact on many subsequent civilizations. Slavery was not just an institution, but one of the foundations on which the entire city of Rome was built. Its structure and ideas spread far beyond Rome, and its legacy can be seen in various forms of exploitation of labor and human dignity throughout history. Slavery did not disappear after the fall of the Roman Empire. On the contrary, many aspects of slavery were adapted to the conditions of the Middle Ages, although in a slightly different form. Roman slavery practices were borrowed and modified in various regions where feudal structures continued to exist after the collapse of Rome. However, the social position of people at the bottom of the social ladder did not change radically. During the Middle Ages, there was a form of slavery associated with land ownership known as serfdom. Although it was not an exact continuation of the Roman system of slavery, many of the same principles continued to exist. Serfs were obliged to work on the land of their lords, and their situation resembled slavery, despite the fact that they were technically free men. They could not leave their land, and their labor was used to provide for the lords. The feudal system that emerged from the ruins of the Roman Empire retained aspects of a brutal social hierarchy. Slavery became less obvious in the Middle Ages, but it remained an important part of the social structure. Many elements of Roman culture, including the exploitation of labor, continued to influence medieval life. With the advent of modern times, with the intensification of trade and maritime expeditions, slavery took on a new form. Unlike the Roman Empire, where slaves were usually local residents, by the beginning of the 16th century, slavery had become a mass and international phenomenon. The colonization of Africa, Asia, and the Americas resulted in the establishment of a transatlantic slave trade, in which millions of people from Africa were forcibly transported to the New Worlds to work on plantations, in mines, and in other sectors of the economy. This form of slavery resembled the Roman system in its cruelty and disrespect for human dignity, but it was massive in scale and international in nature. Colonial powers such as Spain, Portugal, Great Britain, and France actively used slaves to work on sugar plantations, in mines, and in other profitable enterprises in Africa and America. Slavery became not just a tool for using labor, but also part of the mechanism of exploitation of colonized peoples. The Roman system of slavery and the slave-owning approach to labor became the basis for these new global processes. Unfortunately, slave labor during this period did not change. It was the exploitation of people under incredibly cruel conditions, which is reminiscent of the horrors that existed in Rome. Slavery in the New Age acquired terrible proportions and, as in ancient Rome, did not lead to significant improvements in the lives of slaves, but only increased social inequality. One of the most significant influences that slavery had on subsequent eras was the development of philosophical and legal theories that defended human rights and criticized slavery. In ancient Rome, philosophers such as Seneca, Cicero, and Epictetus, despite being part of the Roman elite, could not help but notice the cruelty of slavery. Although they did not advocate the complete emancipation of slaves, their philosophy questioned the morality of slavery, emphasizing the importance of humanity, free will, and dignity. During the Middle Ages and Renaissance, philosophers such as Thomas More and Michel de Montaigne began to develop ideas related to personal freedom and human rights, which in some ways anticipated the ideas of abolitionism. However, real change began only in the 18th and 19th centuries, when philosophical and moral arguments began to attract public attention in Europe and America. Ideas about the right of every person to freedom and dignity became the basis for the fight against slavery, which eventually led to the abolition of the slave trade and slavery in most countries. In 1833, Britain passed the Slavery Abolition Act, and in 1865, the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution was passed, finally freeing slaves in countries where slavery was legal. These changes, of course, did not disappear immediately or eliminate all forms of inequality, but they were an important step in the movement toward a more just society in which human rights played a key role. Slavery, especially its Roman and colonial forms, became a catalyst for changes in concepts of human rights and social justice. The example of slaves fighting for freedom and philosophical reflections on human dignity became important foundations for the human rights movement in later eras. The history of slavery reminds us that any advance in human rights and social justice must be made through an understanding of the past. We must remember those who suffered to avoid repeating these terrible mistakes. It also serves as a reminder of how easily the oppression and exploitation of people can be justified when they are denied voices and rights. Even though slavery has been officially abolished, modern forms of labor exploitation, such as modern slave labor, continue to exist. This can be seen in labor camps, migrant labor conditions, where people are subjected to slave-like conditions. And even though we live in an era of freedom and human rights, the issues of exploitation of people, including children and women, remain relevant. The legacy of slavery in Rome and later times reminds us of the importance of fighting for the rights of every individual, and that, despite social progress, we must be vigilant to avoid repeating these historical mistakes. The history of slavery in ancient Rome is an important lesson for future generations. We must remember that slavery is not just part of the past, but has left an indelible mark on the fabric of human societies. It left moral, philosophical, and political lessons that continue to evolve in the centuries after Rome. The task of each generation is not only to remember and learn from history, but also to strive to create a more just society, where every person, regardless of their background, has equal rights and opportunities. Slavery in ancient Rome was a systemic institution that supported the wealth and power of the empire, but also caused unimaginable suffering for millions of people. This terrible institution, despite its cruelty, became a catalyst for social and moral changes that eventually led to the recognition of human rights and the fight for the freedom and dignity of each individual. Our goal is to remember the past, to not gloss over its terrible aspects, to avoid repeating these mistakes in the future. Slavery left its mark on history, but it is through recognizing its cruelty that we can strive for a world where the value of every human being is recognized and protected. The history of slavery in ancient Rome is not just a glimpse into the past, but an important lesson that is still relevant today. Slavery left a deep mark on the history of not only Rome, but all subsequent civilizations, and continues to influence how we understand human rights and freedom. Now, in the 21st century, we live in an era where most countries in the world have officially abolished slavery and enshrined human rights as fundamental. However, forms of human exploitation continue to exist in various parts of the world, albeit in more hidden and less obvious forms. Modern slavery can take the form of forced labor, human trafficking, exploitation of migrants, forced imprisonment, and other forms of oppression that, despite struggle and awareness, remain a reality. So, when we think about slavery in ancient Rome, it's important not only to examine it as a historical phenomenon, but also to think about how the lessons we learn from this era can help us build a just society. Rome's slavery showed how easily the oppression of entire populations can be justified, and slave revolts show how the human struggle for freedom, even when it ends in defeat, serves as an inspiration for future generations. By studying slavery, we also understand the importance of equality, respect, and fairness in human relationships. We teach that every person, regardless of their background, deserves to be treated with dignity, and that any form of violence and exploitation must be condemned and eradicated. Sometimes in our daily lives, we face challenges and difficulties, but it is important to remember that true freedom begins with respect for each other and the pursuit of justice. Knowing history helps us not to repeat old mistakes and helps us build a world in which every person has the right to freedom, dignity, and a chance for a better future. So, let us use the lessons of the past as a compass to create a world where there is no place for oppression or slavery, and where every person is valued and respected as an equal among equals.